When you walk into a restaurant and order a meal, have you ever wondered what's actually inside of your food? We usually only think about things like how good it looks or how amazing it'll taste. What you don't see are the tiny plastic fragments of plastics that are hidden in the food that are silently contaminating the things you eat every day. Good morning, present teachers. My name is Jeremy, and today I will be presenting to you about my research project regarding microplastics in food consumption. So what are microplastics? Microplastics are tiny plastic particles that cannot be seen with the naked eye, and they cause so much harm towards our health as well as our environment, which means that it is a major issue for us. But a bigger issue is the fact that some people aren't aware of this issue. According to Bernardo Lemos, a professor of environmental epigenetics from Harvard, that there are so many unknowns about microplastics, which also led me to wonder, are there some things that could affect the level of knowledge when it comes to microplastics? There are actually some theories created by the National Library of Medicine back in the research they did in 2022. They concluded that the females showed significantly higher results than the males when it comes to knowledge of microplastics. In addition to that, the people who are studying science showed a higher understanding than the people who are studying humanities, social studies, as well as engineering. So my research is done to investigate whether or not people in Indonesia and Surabaya has the same awareness pattern, or they have something similar. In addition to that, I also will explain whether or not things like field of study or gender could have an effect on awareness levels in microplastics, in correlation with the 12th SDG, responsible consumption and production. So to collect the data that I needed for this research, I collected a total of 83 respondents, 42 from Singapore and 41 from Indonesia. Specifically, adolescents on the ages of 17 to 24, and asked experts in each country to support my data. So one of the factors that could actually expose us to microplastics is buying processed foods. There has been some research about processed foods containing microplastics, things like milk, cheese, bread, and much more. And when the respondents were being asked about this issue, a majority of both of them in both countries showed high concern and acknowledged that it is something important to reduce. However, when it comes to taking action and actually changing their eating habits, despite a majority of them in Indonesia being willing to change, there is a huge sum of them leaning more towards unwilling to change. And in Singapore, they are still moderately willing to change their actions. When it comes to our lifestyle, it is by the plastics ocean that we have developed a disposable lifestyle, a lifestyle of which we tend to rely more on single-use plastic products. And based on my research, it is actually proven correct. When the respondents were being asked how often they purchase these products, the majority of them said 3 to 5 days in a week, which is often. However, when it comes to recycling the plastic waste they use, a majority of them said they rarely recycle, even though they are aware that not recycling could cause an increase in pollution. And this factor could happen due to some things, one of them being people choosing practicality instead of environmental sustainability, as said as one of my experts, Budiono. Another thing is the fact that that Indonesians aren't really exposed to environmentally friendly things, like water fountains that are drinkable, which are accessible in Singapore, which leads to more plastic waste. So to dive deeper and understand about their knowledge regarding this topic, I asked them their claims, whether or not they are aware of microplastics and its presence in food. However, to test if their claims are actually true, I asked 3 questions about microplastics: how they enter our human body, the health effects, as well as where they can be found. And the result shows that the knowledge and awareness of microplastics in Indonesia and Singapore could vary, where both countries claimed that they have higher awareness when it comes to microplastics in food. However, in detail, the Singaporeans did better on knowing where microplastics come from, and Indonesians know more about the health effects of microplastics. However, both of these countries answered how microplastics enter our human body incorrectly. But if you look in detail, Indonesians did do better than the Singaporean data, which could happen due to the lack of awareness as well as research that is done in Singapore, according to one of my experts. So now testing on the theory of gender as well as field of study by the National Library of Medicine. So I did the same method of asking them 3 questions as well as their claims. And the result shows that females in Indonesia claimed that they are more aware of the presence of microplastics and in food as well as more familiar with them. And they proved their claims right because they got a higher average than the male respondents. In addition to that, the female in Singapore, however, claimed that they are more aware of the presence in food, but familiar of presence in microplastics. However, the male respondents claimed that they are more aware of its presence in food. But when being tested, the male respondents got a really low average score of 1.867, which proves that the women still did no better than the male respondents. So from this, we can conclude that it could be a general pattern, and it could be something that is constant. And gender actually has a role when it comes to awareness level. When it comes to field of study, I did the same method of asking 3 questions as well as their claim. And the results showed that science and health did get a higher average than social studies and humanities. However, engineering and technology actually did better than science and health. And a major that did surprisingly really well is art and design, having a really high average in both countries compared to the other majors. So even though that field of study could have an effect on awareness and the level of knowledge, it does not necessarily mean that people who study science and health would know better than the other majors. Meaning that it is not a consistent trend, and it does not match with what the theory of the National Library of Medicine suggests. So what we can conclude from this research is the fact that awareness levels could differ due to gender as well as field of study. And however, despite the gender or field of study, we can also conclude that the majority of both respondents actually answered how microplastics enter our body incorrectly, which shows that people are not really aware when it comes to contamination of microplastics, and people are not really aware when it comes to the spread of microplastics. And without really underlining and knowing about this issue, people will not take it more seriously. Another thing is there's a gap between awareness as well as action, where people are aware that not recycling could cause an increase in microplastic pollution, but they still choose to do it anyway. Another thing is they have a gap between concern and action, where they are concerned about consuming microplastics to their food, but they're not doing anything about it. And lastly, the lifestyle of plastic and how it affects us. We tend to rely more on plastic waste because in Indonesia we do not have things that are available in Singapore, things like water fountains that are drinkable. And we also tend to rely more on practicality instead of environmental responsibility. So these are the things that I recommend. So we should increase in public education. We should have campaigns that not only focus on raising awareness, but also focus on explaining how this issue is really serious. There should be strict regulations by the government about plastic waste. It would encourage other people to actually take it seriously and know more about this topic. And finally, we should spread awareness and take action. We don't only spread awareness about this topic, we need to take action. We need to realize that the small things that we do, something as simple as using a tumbler instead of a plastic bottle, could influence other people to actually change and take action. And these are the references that I used for my research. That is it for my presentation. I hope from this topic you can learn the contamination and dangers of microplastics when it comes to food. Thank you and God bless you.